Once upon a time in Yoruba land, the sun had barely risen over yet the great city was already alive with the sounds of morning. The air was thick with the scent of freshly pounded yam, the tang of smoking fish, and the rich perfume of other-dyed fabric swaying on wooden stalls. Market women balanced woven baskets on their heads, calling out their wares: roasted plantains, clay pots, beads strung with coral. The pounding of a talking drum echoed from a distant courtyard, carrying news from one end of the kingdom to another. Among the bustling crowd, Adunola walked with the grace of a woman both admired and envied. She was breathtakingly beautiful, not in the fragile way of maidens who had never known hardship, but in the way of a storm waiting to break. Her dark skin glowed with the sheen of shea butter. Her eyes held the sharpness of a woman who had learned too much too soon, and her braided hair, done with tiny gold beads, caught the morning light like scattered embers. But today, despite her usual composure, her heart was a restless drumbeat in her chest. She had heard the whispers before, but only now did they carry weight. The king had set his eyes on her, an old woman murmured near the kolanut stall, not realizing Adunola was within earshot. The warrior's daughter, another voice chimed in. She will not refuse. No woman refuses the king. Adunola's fingers crawled into the fabric of her wrapper, her breath tightening in her throat. The king had chosen her. King Dheymer, the man whose word shaped destinies, the king who could make a commoner into a queen or reduce a noble to nothing, had sent word to her father. And no father could refuse such a summons. She swallowed hard, lifting her chin. She would not let them see her fear. But fear was there, coiled deep inside her like a serpent, waiting to strike. Because if she entered the palace, she would never leave it the same way. You should be honored. Her father's voice was deep, measured, the voice of a man who had seen war, who had killed in the name of the kingdom. Palankalao stood before her in their family's inner courtyard, dressed in the battle-worn tunic that spoke of his many victories. His scarred arms were crossed over his chest, and his expression was unreadable. Adunola had spent her childhood idolizing him, a warrior so respected that even the king sought his counsel. But now, as he regarded her with the same look he gave his soldiers before sending them to war, she understood. This was not a father speaking to his daughter. This was a warrior offering his bloodline to the empire. The king has called for you, he continued, as if his words were not, a blade carving into her ribs. It is a great honor. Our family's name will rise with you. She lifted her chin. And what if I do not wish to go? A rare flicker of emotion crossed his face, displeasure, perhaps even regret, but it was gone before she could grasp it. What you wish does not matter, he said at last. King Dheymer has spoken. Her pulse pounded. And if I refuse? Balunun Alao exhaled, his voice lowering like distant thunder. Then I will go to war to defend our honor. Adunola's throat burned. He would fight for her refusal, but he would not fight to keep her free. There was no choice. She had been chosen, and soon she would belong to a man she did not love. The weight of it settled over her like a suffocating veil as she walked through the corridors of their compound. Servants rushed to prepare her belongings, murmuring blessings under their breath. Some envied her, others pitied her. She did not stop walking until she reached the familiar path that led to the outskirts of the city, to the place where he waited. She found him, as she always did, beneath the great Iroko tree, his hands stained with clay, his chisel resting beside him. Arimu, the man who had shaped the face of gods in wood and stone, the man whose hands had traced the curves of her face with the same devotion he gave his sculptures, the man she loved, and the man she would now have to leave behind. She did not speak right away. She only watched him, memorizing every detail, the way his brows furrowed in concentration, the way his strong arms flexed as he carved, the way the evening light kissed his skin. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. The moment their eyes met, he knew. Something in him stilled, his jaw tightening, his breath unsteady. "What is it?" he asked, though his voice carried the weight of a man who already knew the answer. Her throat tightened. "It is the king." A long silence. Then, slowly, Aremo rose to his feet. His hands, calloused from years of sculpting, curled into fists. For the first time in her life, Adunala saw helplessness in his eyes. The king had chosen, and no man could fight the will of a king. The night air was thick with the scent of earth after light rain, the distant hum of Oriki, praise chants carrying from the city's heart. Even now, in the hush between dusk and dawn, drummers still tapped soft rhythms in the palace square. Warriors sharpened their blades, and traders whispered of deals to be made before the next market day. But in the shadows beneath the Iroko tree, none of it mattered. Here there was only Adunola and Aremo. She had expected rage. She had expected him to curse the king, to storm away in despair. But instead, he stood before her in a silence so deep, so vast, it threatened to swallow her whole. "You should say something," she murmured, barely able to hear her own voice over the pounding of her heart. Aremo exhaled, running a hand over his face. His fingers came away streaked with clay, the remnants of a sculpture unfinished, a life interrupted. "What do you want me to say, Adon?" His voice was quiet, rough. "That I will go to the palace and challenge the king himself? That I will carve the gods from stone and beg them to rewrite your fate?" Her throat burned. "I want you to tell me what we are supposed to do." At that, he finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw it. The war in his heart. For as long as she had known him, Aremo had been a man who shaped dreams into something tangible, something permanent. His hands gave form to the divine, his mind saw what others could not. But here was a battle he could not fight, a future he could not sculpt into existence. "I will wait for you," he said, the words heavy with a desperate kind of hope. She reached for his hand, gripping them tightly. "You cannot." "Then what do you want from me?" His voice broke, and for the first time since she had known him, Aremo looked lost. She had no answer, because what she wanted was impossible. She wanted to stay. She wanted to run. She wanted to tear the stars from the sky and scatter them at the feet of the king in defiance. But more than anything, she wanted a choice. And that had been taken from her the moment the king spoke her name. A cold breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves above them. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird let out a lonely cry. She knew she had to go. The sun would rise soon, and with it, the royal messengers would come to collect her. Once she entered the palace, there would be no more secret meetings beneath Iroko trees, no more whispered confessions under the moon's gaze. No more Aremo. So she cupped his face, memorizing every line, every scar from his chisel slip, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips. And she kissed him, not with the soft sweetness of a maiden's first love, nor the light-hearted playfulness of stolen moments, but with the sorrow of a woman who belonged to another. A farewell wrapped in longing. A final act of defiance against a fate neither of them could change. When she pulled away, she did not cry. Tears would do nothing. Instead, she turned and walked into the night, toward the life waiting for her inside the palace walls. And Aremo did not call her back. Because what was the point of calling for someone who was already gone? The palace was a world of golden opulence and hidden knives. It stretched endlessly before her, its vast courtyards and winding corridors filled with the echoes of past queens and forgotten ambitions. Walls of red clay rose high, lined with intricate carvings of battles won, gods appeased, and kings who once ruled with iron and fire. The palace of the king of Yoruba land was a kingdom within a kingdom, a place where beauty masked cruelty, where whispers could be more dangerous than swords, where favor was a currency that could buy either comfort or death. And Adunola had just been thrown into its depths. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the great Afin. From the moment she stepped through the grand gates, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. The king's messengers had announced her arrival long before she crossed the threshold, and already the palace walls buzzed with gossip. She is the daughter of Ologun, the war hero. They say she's more beautiful than the river goddess herself. Back another plaything for the king. Adunola kept her chin high, though her heart pounded in her chest. She would not be cowed. She had been raised by a warrior, a man who had taught her that power was not only in the sword, but in the way one carried themselves. But here, in this place of rival queens and scheming nobles, she knew she was stepping into a battlefield unlike any she had ever known. The king's steward, an aging man with sharp eyes and a voice like rusted iron, led her toward the royal quarters. "You'll be taken to the queen mother first," he said without looking at her. "She will decide where you belong." Adunola swallowed. The queen mother, the true power behind the throne. It was said that the king could take as many wives as he pleased, but it was the queen mother who decided which ones were worthy. She had seen many young brides come and go, some rising to power, others fading into obscurity, or worse. The corridors twisted like the paths of fate, leading her through halls lined with silk-draped columns, past courtyards where eunuchs stood like statues, past open chambers where queens lounged on woven mats, their laughter honeyed but their gazes sharp. And then, finally, she stood before the queen mother's chambers. The doors were carved with the image of a great leopard, its golden eyes glinting in the torchlight. A warning, a reminder of who ruled here. The steward knocked once, then stepped aside. The doors creaked open. Adunola stepped forward into the den of the most powerful woman in the kingdom. The queen mother sat upon a high-bed throne of ebony wood, her head adorned with a crown of coral beads. She was older than Adunola had expected, but there was nothing weak about her. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were as sharp as a warrior's blade. She studied Adunola for a long moment before speaking. "Oh," she said, her voice smooth as oil. "You are the one my son has chosen." Adunola bent her knees in a deep bow. "Yes, great mother." A flicker of amusement crossed the older woman's face. "You know how to show respect. That is good. But tell me, girl, do you know how to survive?" Adnola's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, you are young," the queen mother interrupted. "Beautiful, but beauty in this palace is both a gift and a curse." "Do you know why?" Adnola hesitated, then answered carefully. "Because beauty invites jealousy." A slow smile spread across the queen mother's lips. "Clever girl." She rose from her throne and stepped forward, her robes whispering against the marble floor. She reached out and cupped Adnola's chin, tilting her face upward. "The king has many wives," she murmured. "Some old and wise, some young and hungry, each one fighting for his favor, for power, for survival." Her thick fingers tightened just slightly. "If you are foolish, you will be crushed before the year is done." Adunola held her gaze, refusing to look away. "I do not intend to be foolish." For a moment, silence stretched between them, and then the queen mother laughed. It was a rich, full sound, unexpected in its warmth. She released Adunola's chin and stepped back. "You may survive yet." She turned to the steward. "Take her to the wives' quarters. Let the other queens see what they are up against." Adunola bowed once more before she was led away. But as she left the chamber, she could feel the queen mother's gaze lingering on her. A test had been given, a test had been passed, but the war for survival had only just begun. The wives' quarters were not a place of sisterhood. It was a battlefield, a world of silk and venom, where women dressed in richly woven asuoke and coral beads sat in shaded courtyards, sipping palm wine with lips that whispered secrets and eyes that searched for weakness. The moment Adnola stepped through the arched entrance, conversation dropped into silence. Every gaze turned to her, the newest wife, the latest rival. The steward left her standing alone beneath the flowering vines of the courtyard. A soft wind carried the scent of clove and hibiscus, but there was nothing sweet in the air. Adunola forced herself to stand tall, meeting the silent stares with a steady gaze. She would not let them see fear. A woman rose from a cushioned bench, her movements deliberate, almost lazy. She was older, with dark, intelligent eyes and a knowing smirk, dressed in layers of deep purple and gold. The first wife. She studied Adunola like one would a new piece of jewelry, admiring yet assessing its worth. "Oh," she finally said, her voice smooth as oil, "this is the girl who has stolen the king's attention." Laughter rippled through the gathered queens, soft but sharp. Adunola kept her expression composed. "I did not steal anything." The first wife's smile widened, but it did not reach her eyes. "Oh, but you did, my dear," she murmured. "You just don't realize it yet." She stepped closer, brushing an idle hand along Adunola's arm, a touch that felt more like a warning than a welcome. In this palace, to be noticed by the king is both a blessing and a burden," she said. "Many would kill for his favor." Her fingers lingered a moment longer before she stepped away, turning to the other queens with a knowing look. "I wonder how long she will last." More laughter, this time louder. Adunola clenched her fists beneath the flowing sleeves of her wrapper. She would not let them rattle her. The first wife sank gracefully back onto her seat. "The palace has its ways, little one. Some of us rise, some of us disappear." Adunola met her gaze, her heart pounding. She understood the message beneath the words. This was no ordinary rivalry, this was a war, and she had just been thrown into the center of it. That night, Adunola was given her own chamber, a beautifully adorned room of carved wooden panels and embroidered cushions. The scent of fresh oils lingered in the air, a basin of warm water waiting for her to wash. But beneath the luxury, there was something cold, hollow. She was alone. She sat on the edge of her sleeping mat, staring at her reflection in the polished bronze mirror. The girl staring back at her looked the same, yet everything had changed. Her heart ached for the life she had left behind, for Arimo, for her father, for the freedom of running through the market streets without fear. Now, every step she took had to be measured. A soft rustle at the doorway made her tense. Quarter tense incubated. A young girl, no older than 14, stepped inside and bowed deeply. "My lady, I am Tani, your new handmaiden." Adunola's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Tani," she repeated. The girl hesitated, then glanced around the chamber before whispering, "You must be careful here." Adunola's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Tani's eyes darted toward the door before she continued. "There are those who already wish to see you fall. I heard the other queens speaking when they thought I wasn't listening." Adunola's stomach twisted. She had known she would not be welcomed, but so soon? Tani lowered her voice further. "They will test you, my lady. They will find your weaknesses, and when they do..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Adunola already understood. This was not just about winning the king's favor. This was about survival. She met Tani's worried gaze, something hardening inside her. She had not asked for this life, but she would not be its victim either. Adunola had been born to a warrior. She would learn the rules of this battle, and she would play to win. The palace was a world of golden opulence and hidden knives. Every corridor gleamed with polished brass and woven tapestries. Every courtyard overflowed with perfumed gardens where servants whispered, messengers hurried, and the unseen eyes of the palace watched everything. To an outsider, it was a kingdom of majesty, but Adunola had quickly learned the truth. To be favored here was a gift wrapped in venom. To be overlooked was to fade into dust. The summons came at dusk. Tani burst into Adunola's chamber, breathless. "My lady, the king has called for you." Adunola's pulse quickened. She had been in the palace for only a few days, but already the weight of watching eyes and whispering lips pressed against her like a noose. She had expected this moment to come. Still, she was not prepared. Tani helped her dress. A royal wrapper of deep blue, embroidered with golden thread. Her hair was styled in elegant braids, adorned with ivory beads. When she looked at herself in the polished bronze mirror, she saw a queen. Yet, beneath the layers of silk and jewels, her heart ached for the woman she used to be. She thought of Aremo, of his rough hands shaping clay, of the scent of wood shavings and river water on his skin. She thought of the life she had almost had. But that life was gone. With a steadying breath, she stepped into the night. The Alafin's chambers were a palace within a palace. Ivory pillars stretched toward the heavens, their carvings whispering the stories of kings long past. Oil lamps burned low, casting flickering shadows across the lion-skin rugs that covered the floor. Adunola entered, her steps silent but sure. The king sat reclined on a golden couch, his robes embroidered with the symbols of his divine lineage. Beside him, a griot plucked softly at a kora, filling the room with a melody as smooth as honey. But Adunola's attention was drawn to the figure at his side. The first wife. She sat beside the king like a coiled serpent, draped in purple silk, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "My lord," Adunola murmured, bowing low. The Alafin studied her, his gaze lingering. "Rise, Adunola." She did. He gestured to a platter of fruits and kola nuts beside him. "Sit. Eat." She hesitated only a moment before obeying. The first wife poured palm wine into a bronze goblet and handed it to the king. Her hands, adorned with rings, moved with practiced grace. "She is lovely, is she not?" she murmured, her eyes flickering to Adunola. Adunola's skin prickled. There was something in the woman's tone. The Alafin smiled. "Yes, she is." He turned to Adunola, his expression unreadable. "You must understand, Adunola. The palace is no place for the weak. The women here, they will test you." He leaned forward slightly. "But I have no use for a woman who cannot hold her own." Adunola met his gaze. She knew what he was asking. He wanted to see if she would survive the storm, if she was worthy of standing among his queens. Adunola straightened her back. She had been raised by a warrior. She had learned the art of strategy before she had learned to weave. "I understand, my lord," she said softly. The king chuckled, pleased. He reached for a goblet of his own, lifting it toward her. "Your future." Adunola lifted hers in response, though the wine burnt her throat like poison. The first wife watched, her expression as still as a hunting owl. Later that night, as Adunola returned to her chambers, she found something waiting for her. A small cat figurine sat upon her sleeping mat. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. A woman, standing tall, a single vulture perched on her shoulder. A silent message. The vultures were watching. She clenched her jaw, placing the carving carefully on the table beside her. She would not be their prey. She would learn their games, and she would play them better. The palace air was thick with the scent of burning incense and unspoken threats. Adunola had not slept. The wooden figurine sat on her bedside table, its carved vulture staring back at her, a warning, a promise, a challenge. She had spent the night tracing its edges, thinking, who had left it? The first wife? A jealous queen? A hidden enemy? By dawn she knew one thing. She could no longer move blindly. She needed to see the river goddess. The river goddess was the most powerful priestess in the palace, a woman whose voice could bend fate itself. Her shrine stood at the edge of the royal compound, nestled in a sacred grove where silk cotton trees loomed like ancient sentinels. It was said that the river whispered her secrets to the priestess, gifting her sight beyond sight. Only the foolish ignored her wisdom. Adunola was not foolish. She covered herself with a plain wrapper and slipped into the early morning mist. The grove was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of wind chimes made from cowrie shells, the distant trickle of water. At the heart of it all sat the river goddess. She was old, yet her skin gleamed with the luster of youth, her hair wrapped in a blue headscarf adorned with white beads. Before her, a clay bowl held offerings of honey, river stones, and fresh kola nuts. She did not look up when Adunola arrived. "I have been expecting you," she said. Adunola hesitated. "How did you know I would come?" The priestess smiled. "Because the river always calls those who are drowning." A chill ran down Adunola's spine. The river goddess gestured to the stool beside her. "Sit, child." Adunola obeyed. For a moment, the grove was silent except for the rustling of leaves. Then the priestess reached for a small gourd and poured water onto the earth. She touched the wet soil with her fingers, then closed her eyes. "Your path is lined with fire," she murmured. "Your heart belongs to another, yet your hands are bound by the king." Adunola's breath caught in her throat. "She knows." The priestess's eyes snapped open, sharp as a hawk's. If you stay in this palace, you will either become a queen or a corpse. The words slammed into Adinola's chest. She had known the palace was dangerous, but to hear it spoken aloud, to have it woven into prophecy, it was something else entirely. Then what must I do? She whispered. The princess studied her for a long moment. Then she reached beneath her robe and pulled out a small bone-white talisman. A single red thread wound around it. Here is a way, she said, but it comes at a cost. Adinola swallowed hard. What cost? The river goddess handed her the talisman. It was warm, pulsing as though it had a life of its own. If you use this, the king's eyes will turn from you. His love will sour, his favor will fade. He will cast you aside like an unwanted meal. Adonola's fingers tightened around the charm. A way out. Freedom. But the priestess wasn't finished. But beware, child. If you break free, you will not return to the life you had before. Adinola frowned. What do you mean? The priestess's gaze was unreadable. You may run from the king, but you cannot run from destiny. As Adinola walked back through the palace gates, the talisman hidden in the folds of her wrapper, her mind spun with possibilities. The priestess had given her a choice, one that could either save her or doom her. But one thing was certain. No matter what happened, she would not be a pawn in this game. She would decide her own fate, even if it meant setting fire to everything. The talisman burned against Adinola's skin, its presence heavy as if the gods themselves watched. She had spent the night staring at it, tracing the red thread wound around its center, replaying the priestess's warning. To use this, the king's eyes will turn from you. His love will sour, his favor will fade, he will cast you aside like an unwanted meal. Was that not what she wanted? To be free? To slip away from the vulture-chimed queens and the golden cage of the palace? And yet, something in the priestess's voice haunted her. You may run from the king, but you cannot run from destiny. Morning came, and with it, the weight of expectation. Adinola dressed in silence, allowing Tani to wrap her in coral beads and weave gold into her braids. Today, she was expected to attend the king's court, where she would sit among his wives as petitions were heard. The thought made her stomach churn. When she stepped into the grand hall, the scent of sandalwood and fresh palm wine clung to the air. The queen sat in a careful hierarchy, some whispering, others watching. The king sat on his high throne, dressed in deep purple, his crown gleaming under the morning light. His eyes flickered to Adinola as she entered. There was a hunger there, a claiming. She clenched her fists. She would not be claimed. As she lowered herself into her seat, a familiar voice murmured beside her. You look troubled, little bird. It was the first wife. Adinola kept her face composed. I am merely taking in the quote, my queen. The first wife smiled, slow and knowing. Then take it in well. There is much to learn, and even more to fear. The words sent a chill through her bones. She needed to act tonight. That evening, she prepared the talisman. She unwrapped the red thread, let it fall away, and whispered the words the river goddess had told her. The air grew thick, charged, as if something unseen had stirred awake. Then, as quickly as it came, the feeling passed. The talisman lay cold in her palm. It was done. She did not know when or how the spell would take effect, but she knew the course had been set. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a breath of relief. The change came faster than she expected. By the next day, the king barely looked at her. By the end of the week, he had stopped calling for her. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Adinola felt it like the loosening of chains. The queens noticed. The courtiers whispered. The first wife watched, but Adinola did not care. She was slipping from the king's grasp. She was almost free, until the rumors began. She was walking through the palace gardens when Tani rushed to her side, breathless. "My lady, they say you are cursed." Adunola stopped cold. "What?" Tani lowered her voice. "The palace is speaking of it. They say the king has turned from you because you brought bad luck, that you are unworthy." Adunola's heart pounded. This was not what she had expected. She had thought the king would simply lose interest, that she would fade into the background. But this was dangerous. An unloved queen could be cast aside, but a cursed queen, she could be disposed of. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "Who is saying this?" Tani hesitated. "I do not know where it began, but I heard the first wife speaking of it today." "Of course." Adunola's skin prickled. The first wife was watching, waiting. She had weakened Adunola's position, and now she was moving to strike. That night, Adunola lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had done what she thought was right. She had played the game, used the priestess's magic to push the king away. But she had not accounted for what would happen after. She had not expected to be labeled a curse. She had not expected to become prey. The first wife wanted her, and if she did nothing, she would be. The days bled into one long stretch of dread. Adunola walked the halls of the palace with her head held high, but beneath the quiet composure, her heart hammered with fear. Every whispered conversation, every glance from the other queens felt like a calculated move in a game she had not fully understood. The first wife was not the only one watching. The nobles too had begun to sense the shift. They knew a queen who had fallen out of favor was nothing but a ticking time bomb in the politics of the palace. Her silence was a weapon, her absence a message. Adunola could feel their eyes following her, cold and calculating, every move under surveillance. She had become a ghost, a queen without power, discarded before her time. Adunola was no longer seen as the precious jewel she had once been, the king's chosen bride. Now, she was a liability, a threat to the delicate balance of power that kept the queens in place. Her beauty, once celebrated, now seemed to mock the palace's fragile unity. The whispers of the other queens had grown sharper, and Adunola's place in the harem seemed more like a cage than a throne. One afternoon, as she walked by the palace river, Tani, the young servant girl who had always admired her, caught up with her, her face pale. "My lady," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I overheard something." Adunola's gaze sharpened, a sudden fear tightening her chest. "What did you hear?" "Dheymer said the king has spoken to the chiefs of the palace guards. They are planning to..." Tani hesitated, swallowing hard. They are planning to imprison you, my lady." Adunola felt her stomach drop. "Imprison me," she repeated softly, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. Tani nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "They say it's because you defied the king, my lady. The first wife has convinced him that you are a threat to his rule, that you could bring unrest to the kingdom, dangerous to his rule." The words echoed in Adunola's mind, the weight of them settling like a stone in her chest. The realization stung bitterly. She had known there would be consequences for her actions, but to be labeled a threat to the kingdom, to be made into a villain for daring to love and choose her own fate, she had never expected it to come to this. Adunola stood still, her hands trembling at her sides. The soft gargling of the river, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. The price of defiance was not just her safety, It was the very thing she had fought to keep, her freedom. And now that freedom was slipping through her fingers. Tani's voice trembled with urgency. You must leave, my lady. Tonight. The guards are already looking for you. Later that night, Adunola made her decision. She could not wait for fate to deliver her punishment. If she was to suffer, she would not let it happen without a fight. The palace had taken enough from her already. It had stolen her love, her peace, and her sense of belonging. She would not let it steal her life. She moved quickly, gathering only what she could carry. Her most cherished pieces of jewelry, a few small keepsakes, and a cloak. Her heart raced as she crept through the corridors of the palace, each step a silent rebellion. She was not a prisoner, she would not be. When morning came, the chief of the guard came before the king, his voice low and urgent. My lord, the princess is missing. It is as we feared. She has fled the palace. But Adunola? She was already gone. Wrapped in a cloak of shadows, she slipped past the palace gates, her breath measured, her steps silent. She did not run. A queen does not run. She simply walked into the darkness, toward whatever fate awaited her beyond these walls. The whole kingdom grew to love her, not as a queen, but as the woman who had chosen her own fate. The marketplace where she had once walked as a warrior's daughter whispered her name like a forbidden prayer. Her story spread like wildfire through the mouths of storytellers, in the songs of bards, and in the hearts of those who longed for a life of freedom. Some said she had died in the forests, her body claimed by the wilds. Others claimed she had fled to a distant kingdom where no man could own her, where she could live as she chose. But in the workshops of sculptors, in the hush of moonlit gatherings, her story lived on. They called her the Moonflower, the one who refused to wither in another man's shadow. And on the hands of a sculptor who once loved her, her name was still carved into stone.